Sunday, September 3rd, 2023, early evening in Luton. A man was walking home when a white van slowed beside him. What happened in the next few seconds would set the tone for everything that followed. Months later, May 10th, 2024, on a quiet Enfield street, a pregnant woman waiting for a cab. A white van pulls up again, but this time, different men with the same intent. Within a few minutes, she disappears before anyone even realizes she's gone. And then, a quiet retail park at Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales. A meeting that was never meant to be simple. And by the end of the night, someone would be fighting for their life. Each carried out with planning, pressure, and control. But the question is, who planned them, why they happened, and how they finally came undone. This is the story of 3 ruthless kidnappings for ransom, and how greed, panic, and one wrong move turned calculated plans into their downfall. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. It was a calm Friday morning in Enfield on the 10th of May, 2024. The roads were still, and there was little to suggest anything unusual would happen. A 36-year-old woman, several months pregnant, left her home just after 8 o'clock. She was due to meet her personal trainer nearby and planned to stop at her mother's house afterwards. It was a normal start to the day. A few streets away, a white Ford Transit van had been parked for some time. Inside were 3 men: Ahmad Ghiassi, aged 26 from Luton, Audi Johnson, 35, from Northolt, and Nicholas Mitchell, 55, from Barnet. They were part of a small network operating across London, involved in schemes that revolved around intimidation and quick profit. Mitchell was the oldest of the 3 and the one thought to have organised what was about to happen. Johnson had a record for violence and was seen as the man to enforce it. Ghiassi was younger and quieter, the driver whose job was to keep the van moving and the plan on schedule. Their target was not chosen at random. They believed the woman could lead them to information about her partner, someone they thought owed money or held something of value. The plan was to take her, frighten her, and use whatever she said to reach him. At around 8:15, the van turned onto the residential street where she was waiting. Witnesses later recalled only the sound of tires on the road and the brief pause of the vehicle outside a row of terraced houses. What followed lasted seconds. The door opened, the men acted quickly, and by the time the van moved off again, the pavement was empty. To those nearby, it looked like a delivery vehicle passing through the neighbourhood. But within minutes, the woman had vanished, and the men in the van had begun the next stage of their plan. Inside the van, the doors were pulled shut and the sound of the street disappeared. The woman was pushed onto the floor and cable ties were tightened around her wrists. A piece of fabric was pulled over her eyes. She could no longer see where she was being taken, only hear the movement of the vehicle and the low voices around her. The men began asking questions almost immediately. They wanted to know about her partner, where he lived, what he did, what money he had. Each question came with a warning, spoken quietly but deliberately. When she hesitated or struggled to answer, the tone instantly changed. One of them told her that if she lied, they would, in his words, kick the baby out of her stomach. She was terrified. The pain from the restraints, the heat inside the van, and the constant threat of violence left her struggling to breathe. The men continued to press her for details about her partner's work and the property he owned. They believed he had cash, jewellery, or something they could take in exchange for her safety. One of the men reached for a phone. She could hear the sound of dialing followed by a short pause. What followed was a series of ransom calls made to her partner. Calm voices demanding money and valuables, telling him that she was with them and that he needed to cooperate if he wanted her returned. Every few minutes, one of the men would raise his voice, asking her again to confirm details about her partner's address, where certain items were kept, and who else might be in the house. Whereas the van kept moving, turning down roads she couldn't identify. She was aware of stopping once or twice, but never for long. By the time the van came to a stop again, the calls had been made, the threats delivered, and the men believed they were close to getting what they came for. But for the woman inside, the fear had only just begun. At some point during the journey, the van came to a stop. The men got out briefly, leaving her alone in the back. She could still hear their voices outside, but for the first time since being taken, there was a pause in the movement. Her hands were still bound, the ties cutting into her wrists. Blindfolded, she could only guess where she was. The silence inside the van lasted longer than before, and in that silence, she began to move. She shifted her weight, trying to loosen the ties, pulling against them until one gave way. It wasn't clean or easy. The plastic cut into her skin, but the restraint began to slip. When she felt it give, she reached for the blindfold, pulling it partly away. The door handle was closed. She turned it slowly, unsure if it would open, and when it did, she took her chance. She stepped out onto the pavement, frightened and unsure where to go. Her only thought was to find help. Moments later, she saw a taxi coming down the road. She waved desperately, and when it stopped, she climbed in and told the driver to take her to her mother's house address. When she arrived, her family were already worried. She was in shock, unable to speak clearly, her wrists marked from the cable ties. Once they understood what had happened, police were called immediately. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Flying Squad took control of the case within hours. Their priority was to locate the van and identify the men responsible before they could disappear. Officers began collecting CCTV from surrounding streets, tracing every route a white Ford Transit had taken through Enfield that morning. Cameras from nearby locations and residential doorbells were reviewed frame by frame. What started as a quiet morning on an ordinary street, by the end of the day, had become a full-scale investigation led by one of the Met's most experienced specialist units. Investigators had begun to piece together the van's movements. Each camera placed it closer to a specific route leading out of Enfield. Using automatic number plate recognition, ANPR, the van's movements were tracked as it crossed into another borough. The plates appeared on several cameras along major routes, confirming it hadn't traveled far. That was enough for detectives to narrow the search radius. Late that same evening, the van was abandoned. It was taken for forensic examination, and what the team found inside confirmed the scale of the evidence left behind. There were fingerprints on the interior panels, DNA traces on the cable ties, and even mobile phone data connecting directly to 3 individuals: Audi Johnson, Nicholas Mitchell, and Ahmad Ghiassi. Each of them already had a history known to the police, men linked to low-level organised activity, what we have already covered and now tied together by physical evidence and surveillance data. The analysis made it clear that this wasn't random. The kidnapping had been a contract job, a planned abduction carried out on behalf of others seeking money or leverage over the victim's partner. With the forensics confirmed, Detective Inspector Ari Yoganathan, leading the flying squad investigation, ordered a series of coordinated arrests. Nicholas Mitchell was tracked through phone and vehicle data to the Barnet area. On the morning of October 29, 2024, officers from the Metropolitan Police Flying Squad intercepted his car on a quiet residential road. Body-worn footage shows Mitchell behind the wheel as officers move in, calm, methodical, and without resistance. He was removed from the vehicle and detained at the roadside. Inside the car, investigators later found items linking him directly to the Enfield abduction, including mobile data tied to the ransom calls. Mitchell was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to kidnap and taken into custody for questioning. In Northolt, the flying squad closed in on Johnson. He was detained during a planned early morning operation. The final arrest came in Luton. Ghiassi was tracked through mobile cell data and CCTV showing him near Enfield on the morning of the abduction. Detectives surrounded the address quietly, moving in before dawn. He was taken into custody without incident, the last member of the trio to be caught. By the end of the operation, all 3 were in custody. In a statement later released by the Met, D.I. Yoganathan described the case as a deliberate, targeted act carried out with the kind of planning we usually see from professional gangs. But what had given them away was their speed, their overconfidence in assuming no one would trace a van through London in a single day. By early summer, the case had made its way to Kingston Crown Court. The evidence gathered by the flying squad was substantial. After months of preparation, the trial opened on June 3, 2025, and lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented the case as a calculated, organised kidnapping carried out for money, while the defence argued the men had been following instructions and were not the masterminds behind it. Audi Johnson, aged 35, from Northolt, had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy to kidnap. He admitted his role from the beginning, likely in the hope of a reduced sentence. Ahmad Ghiassi, 26, from Luton, and Nicholas Mitchell, 55, from Barnet, denied involvement. But the evidence against them was too detailed to ignore. But it was the victim's own words that silenced the room. In her victim impact statement, read aloud to the court, she described how the kidnapping had changed her life entirely. She spoke of the fear that followed her everywhere, of sleepless nights, and of not being able to return home since that morning in May. Judge's remarks echoed the public's reaction. Calling it a disgusting and terrifying crime, the judge emphasized the cruelty of targeting a pregnant woman and the deliberate nature of the threats used to control her. All three were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap. Audi Johnson, aged 35, was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in prison. Ahmad Ghiassi, aged 26, received a 7-year prison sentence. Nicholas Mitchell, aged 55, was handed the longest sentence of 9 years. With the Enfield case closed and its offenders jailed, let's turn our attention to another kidnapping, one far more violent, unfolding just months later in South Wales. It was late evening in Merthyr Tydfil, Monday, the 10th of February, 2025. The car park at Cyfarthfa Retail Park was quiet, the shops closing. Connor Price, 28, had driven there with his girlfriend after receiving a call from Luke Williams, a teenager he knew from Hereford. The meeting was supposed to be straightforward, a chance to settle a matter that had been hanging between them. It would turn out to be anything but. Waiting nearby were 2 others. Tyshane Brown, 30, from Weymouth, was the eldest and the one everyone looked to for direction. He'd driven up from the south coast earlier that day with Williams and another man, George Miles Williams, 24, from Hereford. The group had travelled more than 70 miles with a single purpose, to confront Price and take what they believed was owed to them. When Price arrived, the ambush unfolded with brutal speed. Brown and Williams pulled him toward a waiting Hyundai, telling him they were armed, that there were knives and a gun inside the car. Price's girlfriend, still in his red Vauxhall Astra nearby, could hear raised voices before the door slammed shut. Within seconds, the vehicle sped off across the car park. What had begun as a simple meeting in a car park had turned into a kidnapping that would send shockwaves through the small Welsh town. A calculated act of violence disguised as a business arrangement. Inside the moving car, Connor Price could barely keep conscious. A strip of fabric had been pulled over his eyes, his hands pinned as the men shouted over him. Each demand came with a blow, each question followed by another stab. He had no sense of direction, only the sound of the engine, the men's voices, and the sharp pain spreading through his body. The attackers wanted money, exactly £5,000. They told him to cooperate, to tell his girlfriend where to bring it. When he said he didn't have the cash, the violence intensified. Brown and Williams hit him, then stabbed him again, warning him that this was only the beginning if he didn't comply. Brown pulled out his phone. From the back seat, Connor could hear the dial tone, then the faint sound of his girlfriend's voice as she answered. What followed was a ransom call, cold, methodical, and terrifying. She was told that if she wanted her partner alive, she'd need to find the money immediately, and warned that if she called the police, he would be dead before they reached the next road. In the background, she could hear him pleading for help, screaming that they had knives and a gun. The call cut off abruptly. Inside the car, the atmosphere turned quieter, almost deliberate. They drove through the streets of Merthyr, turning corner after corner, making sure no one could follow. Every time Connor tried to move or resist, he was hit again. He could feel blood soaking through his clothes, 9 stab wounds in all, one deep in his abdomen, another slicing across his thigh. In the Astra parked nearby, his girlfriend sat frozen. She didn't know what to do. The number that had called her was now dead, and she had no idea where he'd been taken. Moments later, she rang Connor's father, Jordan Price, and told him everything: the threats, the ransom demand, and the screams she'd heard over the phone. Within minutes, Jordan called 3 close friends. Together, they began planning what would become one of the most desperate and dangerous rescue attempts the town had ever seen. Jordan Price didn't wait for the police. The moment he heard his son's voice screaming down the phone, he knew there wasn't time. They wanted kidnappers to drop him at the same place they'd taken him, Cy Farthfoot Retail Park. There was no cash, only a jacket rolled tight to look like a bundle of notes. Connor's girlfriend was told to drive to the meeting point alone, drop the jacket, and leave without hesitation. Jordan and his friends would be nearby, watching from a distance, and were ready to act. At around 9:30 p.m., the kidnapper's car, the same Hyundai, pulled into the retail park. The girlfriend parked briefly, dropped the fake ransom, and drove away. One of the kidnappers stepped out to collect it. As he realized the deception, the situation exploded. Jordan and his friends moved fast, pulling their cars across the exit and dropping the barrier to stop the kidnappers from escaping. Shouts echoed through the car park as they ran toward the Hyundai, hitting at the doors and smashing the windows in a frantic attempt to reach Connor. But Brown and Williams forced the car into reverse, then slammed it into gear. Glass shattered as the vehicle broke through the makeshift blockade, one of the rescuers gripping the door handle before being thrown clear as it swerved back onto the road. Jordan jumped back into his own car and went after them. The chase sped through the streets of Merthyr, a father trying to save his son. He caught up with the Hyundai and hit it once, then again, trying to force it to stop. On the third attempt, the impact sent the car sliding sideways across the road. Inside, Connor saw his chance. He pushed the door open and fell out, collapsing onto the tarmac. He was covered in blood, 9 stab wounds in total. One had cut deep into his stomach. Others were to his face, back, thigh, and groin. He was barely conscious. Jordan ran to him, lifted him off the ground, and carried him to his own car. There was no time to wait for an ambulance. He drove straight to Prince Charles Hospital, only minutes away. Doctors later said Connor's injuries were life-threatening. 1 stab wound had come within millimeters of a major artery. He survived after emergency surgery, but the trauma of that night stayed with him and his family long after the roads of Merthyr went quiet again. When the call finally reached South Wales Police, the scene they uncovered was one of chaos. The Hyundai used in the kidnapping had been found abandoned on the outskirts of Merthyr, its doors unlocked, the interior soaked in blood. Detectives sealed off the vehicle, knowing instantly this was no ordinary assault. Inside, forensics teams found clear traces of Connor Price's DNA on the seats, the floor, and the door panels. The sheer volume of blood told its own story. Crime scene officers catalogued every item left behind. Among the evidence were discarded gloves, empty bottles, and traces of fibers matching clothing, later seen in CCTV stills. The forensic match was immediate, confirming this was the same car used during the abduction and attempted murder. Meanwhile, detectives began pulling together the digital trail. Mobile phone data revealed the movement of all 3 suspects across South Wales and into England. Calls placed during and after the attack linked directly to numbers associated with Tyshane Brown, Luke Williams, and George Miles Williams. Within days, police spotted Brown and Williams together at a BP petrol station in Herefordshire. They were calm, casual, and appearing as though nothing had happened. Surveillance footage captured them filling up the car and buying food before driving off again. It was the lead investigators needed. On February 27th, officers from South Wales Police and West Mercia Police located the pair at a caravan park in Kidderminster. A coordinated operation was launched. The site was surrounded and both men were taken into custody without incident. Inside the caravan, detectives recovered several key items: a black balaclava, a knife, and clothing that matched what Williams had been wearing in the BP footage. Each piece of evidence connected them further to the Merthyr attack. George Miles Williams was traced soon after and arrested in Hereford. With all three men in custody, the investigation that began in a blood-soaked car in Merthyr now stretched across 3 counties, the result of a meticulous inter-force manhunt that left little room for escape. By the time the case reached court, the evidence was overwhelming. The trial opened at Merthyr Tydfil Crown Court in August 2025. The prosecution laid out the sequence of events in painstaking details. The 3 men faced a list of serious charges: attempted murder, causing grievous bodily harm with intent, kidnap, blackmail, possession of an imitation firearm, and possession of a bladed article. Each pleaded not guilty, but the jury had little doubt about what had taken place. In October 2025, sentencing took place at Newport Crown Court. Tyshin Brown received the heaviest sentence, 30 years in prison, with an additional 3 years on extended license for being deemed a high-risk offender. Luke Williams was sentenced to 25 years, also with an extended license period of 2 years. George Miles Williams, who was found to have played a lesser but still vital role, was handed 20 years. Together, the total came to 75 years behind bars, a sentence that reflected both the scale of the violence and the terror inflicted on one man and his family. It began in the early evening of Sunday, the 3rd of September 2023, on Havelock Road in Luton. The street was still busy with people heading home, unaware that just a few meters away, a planned kidnapping was about to unfold. The target was a local man, whose name is not publicly released, and we will address him as the victim in our story. According to later court reports, he had recently come into money. 3 men had planned to take him, to bundle him into a van and use him as leverage in what detectives would later describe as a for-profit abduction. The group was made up of 28 years old Dominic Croucher, Jamie Williams in his 40s, and Paul Morell, 39. Each had travelled to Bedfordshire that weekend, moving between hotels and rented vehicles as they prepared for what they thought would be a quick and simple operation. Late that evening, the victim walked along Havelock Road when a white Mercedes van pulled up beside him. Croucher and Williams got out first, followed by Morell close behind. One of them grabbed the man from behind, while another tried to pull his arms together. Witnesses later said there was shouting, a struggle, and the sound of metal on the pavement, handcuffs being snapped open. The men tried to drag him toward the van, but fortunately he fought back, breaking free for only a few seconds before being caught again. Then, by pure chance, a passerby appeared. A man who saw what was happening and shouted across the street. The distraction was enough. The victim pulled loose and ran, leaving the would-be kidnappers frozen for a moment before they fled. In their rush, they left the handcuffs behind on the ground. That single mistake would unravel everything. But before revealing how the ruthless police investigation exposed them, let's look at what the men did in the days that followed their botched attack. What began as a failed kidnapping soon turned into a campaign of intimidation. Just over a week after the botched abduction, on September 11th, 2023, the victim began receiving a series of threatening messages through social media. The messages included photographs of his home and family, taken without his knowledge, alongside warnings that things would get worse if he didn't hand over money. The tone of the threats left little doubt about who was behind them. Investigators later confirmed that the accounts used to send the messages were traced to devices linked with the same group: Jamie Williams, Paul Morell, and Dominic Croucher. It was clear that, even after their failed attempt, the men were determined to frighten the victim into paying up. The situation escalated days later. Late one night, Neighbors in the same Luton street reported seeing flames at the side of the victim's property. When firefighters arrived, they found that a fence and garden shed had been set on fire, the scorch marks running close to the house. No one was injured, but the message was unmistakable. The gang wanted to remind him that they still knew where he lived. Digital forensics provided the breakthrough. A trail of online activity linked the threatening messages to an IP address registered to Paul Morell, placing him at the center of the continued harassment. Search warrants later uncovered further proof: chat logs between Morell and Williams bragging about the arson. In one exchange, they laughed about what they'd done, with one of them writing, "We've blazed his gaff." For Bedfordshire police, this was the confirmation they needed. The kidnap attempt had evolved into a targeted campaign of blackmail and intimidation, carried out across counties and coordinated through phones and social media. What had started as a single act of violence was now a pattern of deliberate terror designed to break one man's sense of safety in his own home. The investigation into the failed Luton kidnapping moved quickly. Detectives from Bedfordshire Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit began by tracing the white Mercedes van seen leaving Havelock Road. CCTV footage from multiple streets captured its movements both before and after the attack, while automatic number plate recognition data showed that its plates had been changed only hours earlier, a clear attempt to conceal its identity. When officers identified the registered keeper, it led straight to Dominic Croucher. His DNA had already been matched to the handcuffs left at the scene, giving police their first solid link. Surveillance teams soon began tracking his movements, connecting him to two other men who had travelled with him from Doncaster, Jamie Williams and Paul Morell. A search warrant executed at Williams's home uncovered the key to the same handcuffs left behind during the attack. Investigators also recovered clothing consistent with witness descriptions from Havelock Road and digital evidence placing him near Luton on the night of the incident. Meanwhile, Morell's rented white Mercedes had appeared on traffic cameras, travelling in convoy with Croucher's van throughout Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. Detectives later concluded this was a deceptive tactic, using two vehicles to obscure their route, swap positions, and make it harder to pinpoint which car was directly involved. Ironically, it was that same convoy pattern that tied Morell and Croucher together. The data confirmed that the abduction was not spontaneous, but a carefully planned cross-county kidnap attempt designed for financial gain. On September 15, 2023, officers arrested Dominic Croucher, and Jamie Williams was detained the same morning in Doncaster. 3 days later, on September 18th, Paul Morell was taken into custody. All three were charged with kidnap, blackmail and arson in connection with the failed abduction and the subsequent fire attack. When the case reached Luton Crown Court, prosecutors presented a wealth of evidence. All three were declared dangerous offenders and recognised as part of an organised criminal group. Dominic Croucher was sentenced to 8 years and 3 months in prison. Jamie Williams received 10 years and 6 months. Paul Morell was also sentenced to 10 years and 6 months. Together, their total sentence amounted to 28 years behind bars. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.